Hello and welcome to Mind, Body, Sleep, the podcast for anyone out there who wants to understand and recover from insomnia using a holistic perspective. I'm Beth Kendall, your host. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Mind, Body, Sleep podcast. I am so pleased to be joined by a very special guest this week. And I say that because I've had the tremendous opportunity of working alongside this wonderful person over the last couple of years in the Mind, Body, Sleep mentorship. And I am talking about my co-coach, Richard Wills. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks so much, Beth. It really is a pleasure to be doing this podcast with you. I've so enjoyed working with you over the past couple of years, and now we're doing another podcast together. So thank you.
Yeah, it's been a while since your original podcast, now that I think back.
It has.
Yeah, yes. It's been probably over a year. Where did the time go? Yeah. So you and I have been talking about, doing an episode together, and you came up with this idea of doing a very foundational episode based on what conventional advice gets wrong about insomnia. And I love this because the folks listening to this podcast have most likely been down many of the roads that we're going to talk about today. And the thing is, a lot of this traditional advice just doesn't always help. And if it did help, we wouldn't have so many people still struggling with insomnia, right? So our goal today is to explain why it doesn't help and give you an introduction into a new way of thinking about sleep. So, Richard, where should we start today?
Well, Beth, I think a good place to start would be to look at the mainstream definition of insomnia, okay? Because that's where things start to go wrong right at the beginning.
Yep.
So in mainstream thinking, insomnia is trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, and then they specify, more than 3 nights a week for at least 3 months. So trouble falling asleep, trouble sleeping. Well, that doesn't really tell us very much. It doesn't tell us, why do you have trouble sleeping?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And our approach to insomnia is very different. For us, insomnia is a learned fear of not sleeping. And we can kind of expand that to say, an ongoing struggle with sleep rooted in the fear of wakefulness, but just basically looking at sleep as a fear-driven issue.
Yeah.
And I think that's really so important. And if we can think about fear, we can call it by different names. We can call it hyperarousal or anxiety or stress. And roughly, they're all grouped together. They have subtle differences. But I think just identifying the role of fear or hyperarousal is so important to understanding what insomnia is.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. That's a great place to start. And I think when we say learned fear of not sleeping or learned anxiety around not sleeping, what we're referring to is that just means conditioned, right? It means It's sort of happening on automatic. And you're so right. I think what kind of sets us apart is most advice does tend to treat the symptom versus the problem, right? So they're going at it from treating, sleeplessness, and we're going at it from what is creating the sleeplessness in the first place. So we're going much more upstream.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. So you did mention the word hyperarousal. And I know that when I heard that word, I don't even remember the context that I heard the word. All I knew is that word felt like what I was experiencing. So what can we share with the people listening? Because I'm guessing I've heard this from many people, right? We've heard many people come through and they say it's really about the hyperarousal. How could we segue into breaking down the true mechanisms of sleep?
Right. Well, Beth, I think it's really important to look at the two things that make sleep possible or that, make it more difficult. Okay. Number one, we have to have sleep drive. And that's largely determined by how long we've been awake that day. So if we get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, then by, maybe 9 o'clock at night, we're going to be tired because of sleep drive. Okay. How we slept maybe the couple of days before that would also perhaps have some influence, but roughly how much sleep we've gotten that day determines sleep drive. So, and then the other thing is the hyperarousal or fear. And if we have plenty of sleep drive, but we have a lot of fear or hyperarousal or increased vigilance, then that's going to get in the way of the sleep drive.
Right.
So we need to have both, meaning that we need to have good, healthy sleep drive, but minimal fear or anxiety or hyperarousal. And those are kind of the two key things. And again, this is something that mainstream thinking about insomnia just doesn't get right. Talk about all kinds of things that influence sleep, but they don't break it down to these two really key factors that we have to understand.
Yeah. Yeah. So well said. And I think I like that it's simple, right? There's just these two things that are how sleep works. And just like you said, the mainstream approach or the traditional approach is focusing on sleep, and we're focusing on hyperarousal, which is what is getting in the way of sleep. And I think it's also worth mentioning to our listeners that, here's the thing for people with insomnia, they almost always have plenty of sleep drive, right? This is not something that you need to worry about that you have enough of unless you're really spending giant quantities of time in bed at night. Most people with insomnia have plenty of sleep drive.
Exactly. Yeah. And to try to ramp up sleep drive is really very counterproductive when you already have really plenty. And all you have to do is get out of the way. You have to get that fear, that hyperarousal out of the way. And then that sleep drive can manifest and put you to sleep.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. So we talked a little bit about in the traditional model, usually what this looks like, and of course, we have been through this, is you might see, you're starting to have trouble with your sleep. You might go to your primary care doctor. Maybe you get started on some medications. This is really when the shift in orientation starts and insomnia starts to evolve. But, we're paying more attention to sleep. And then maybe you see a sleep specialist. Maybe you have a sleep study done. And somewhere along the way, people end up usually in some sort of CBT-I program. And, we've both been through CBT-I. I know I've been through a couple of times.
3 times for me, Beth.
Yeah. And many of our students and clients have come from CBT-I. And we're not about, dissing CBT-I at all. It can be helpful, or parts of it can be helpful. But it can also really miss the mark. And what would help our listeners keep in mind with regards to CBT-I? Okay,
so first of all, CBT-I is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. Yes. And this is like considered the gold standard for treating insomnia. As I just said, I did it 3 times. Yeah. And if anything, it made my insomnia worse.
Yeah.
So now CBT-I has some positive things. It has some educational aspects with it, which I think can be helpful. But one of the big things that CBT-I uses is called sleep restriction.
Yeah.
And the idea is to spend less time in bed. So let's say, I think my CBT-I therapist said, okay, you should go to bed at midnight and get up at 5 a.m.
Yep.
Okay. So that it wasn't spending too much time in bed. Now, I had not been spending inordinate amounts of time in bed. I wasn't in bed for like 12 hours or even 10 hours. So, I was kind of skeptical, but I did it. Mm-hmm. And the idea behind this is that you have to increase your sleep drive. Well, naturally, if you're only in bed for 5 hours, you're only going to have a maximum amount of sleep of 5 hours. So you're going to be sleepier when you go to bed the following night.
Mm-hmm.
And this will increase sleep drive. But as we said earlier, sleep drive isn't the problem for the vast majority of people with insomnia. We have plenty of sleep drive because we're not sleeping enough or a good enough quality.
Yep.
They really harp on the sleep restriction thing when it's like you already have plenty of sleep drive. And the thing about sleep restriction is that for me and for many of the students in our program that I've talked to, it just increases anxiety.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
it just makes me feel, oh my God, I'm already worried enough about my sleep. Now I can't even stay in bed longer than 5 hours. That's terrible.
Right.
And so this just ramped up my hyperarousal, my anxiety. And if anything, it made my sleep worse.
Yeah.
So I think what mainstream sleep specialists fail to see, because they fail to identify hyperarousal or anxiety as the main cause of insomnia, they fail to see that this focus on sleep restriction increases the main cause of insomnia, which is anxiety.
Yep.
So sleep restriction makes, I mean, the vast majority of people I've talked to who've tried CBT-I describe the same issue.
Yes.
Sleep restriction just made them more anxious and made their sleep worse.
Yep. Yep.
So yeah, I'm maybe you feel a little friendlier towards CBT-I than I do, but I just am not a fan of it.
I think if you've had, I mean, I've opened my mind to it because, we're still in such early days of this new paradigm of, I call it insomnia discovery almost. But I, like you, I had a very torturous experience with CBT-I. And, to me, the thought of taking sleep away from somebody who's already not sleeping is just about like the worst thing you can go through. And it just, it sent my nervous system just over the edge, and I'm all about working with your nervous system, not against it. So, treating a condition, a very stressful condition with a stressful approach, just now it just doesn't make sense. At the time, I really did think, well, geez, this is what I have to do to get beyond this problem, and I was willing to do whatever it took, but it truly was torturous. And we're not about any, I say all the time that suffering is not required, to recover.
Absolutely.
To recover from insomnia. So, if you're someone out there that is struggling with it, don't worry, you're not alone. It does sound like the way this gold standard, and it's sort of where people land and end up, that it should work for everyone. And if it doesn't work for you, then you really feel like you're just this, just this really special case that can't be helped. But it's much more common than you might think. So you're not alone if you're someone that this is not working for. And then you talked a lot, you mentioned, basically how sleep efforts feed the problem and just keep us on this hamster wheel, because sometimes for some people and some brains, they welcome the structure of sleep restriction. They're kind of like, okay, maybe they're not as anxiety prone and it's like, tell me what to do. They have a clear-cut path, and then it does help them. Sleep drive increases and they sleep better. And they then attribute their better sleep to this external behavioral tactic.
Right. Yeah.
And then we're still in the same problem. We're still in the externalization of sleep. We're still looking to that we need this outside thing. And, maybe that works for a while, but there's not a guarantee, so we're all about bringing it back to you and fixing this at the root level and getting to the heart of the problem, which really is the conditioned arousal, which is driven by our thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors. So it's much more of an we take a much more enduring approach than constantly having to, seek a fix like sleep restriction.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned sleep efforts, Beth, because they really do feed the problem for so many people with insomnia. So, there's so many things you can do. We talked about sleep restriction as, a sleep effort to make sleep happen. Another thing in CBT-I is stimulus control, which is the rule that if you're awake at night for more than 20 minutes, you should get up and do something and then go back to bed. And again, this is an approach that can trigger a lot of anxiety. It certainly did in me. I'd wake up maybe it was 3:00 in the morning. I try not to look at the clock. And then I said, okay, well, has it been 20 minutes? Well, let me see. I'm not sure. Well, okay. Well, I think it's been 20 minutes. Okay, I'll get up. And then when I've been up for a while, okay, well, I guess I should go back to bed now. And so it just for me, brought up a lot of anxiety about having to do all
Yeah.
these special things
Yeah.
right. And, I didn't do them right. I don't, and I think it's hard to do them right, at least
Yes.
hard to do
Yes.
them right without having a lot of stress and anxiety around them.
Oh, so much so. That's such a good point. We always say that you really can't do any of this wrong. I think and we really see how when people come in from CBTI, how rule oriented they are.
Oh,
And,
yeah. Yeah.
there's just almost a fear of doing it wrong, and you really can't do it wrong. There's nothing you can
Right.
really do wrong in our mentorship and the way we approach it. And most programs do focus on what you do. And we're focusing on much more on how you relate to sleep and what you're going through.
Exactly.
So
Right.
again, it's bringing it back to you versus, the external and the doing. It's really much more about, you really don't have to do much at all. We're helping you undo the doership, and
Yeah.
that could be a tricky one to untangle because we're so used to doing.
And Beth, that works great in most areas of life. Okay.
Yeah,
Whether you're
yeah.
looking for a better job, your finances, your relationships, having kids, whatever it is, well, you think about it and you find solutions to problems. But the thing with sleep, I know it's hard for a lot of our listeners to believe, but sleep is an effortless process.
Yes.
And we get in the way of it by ramping up all these efforts, whether it's this sleep restriction or a stimulus control that CBT-I advocates, or it's blackout curtains, or it's melatonin or sleepy time tea, or having an elaborate wind down every evening, or even meditation. I mean, some of these things can have some value,
Yeah.
but it really depends on your attitude toward it, your intent toward it.
Yep.
I find that these sleep people who use CBT-I just are so focused on these sleep efforts.
Mm-hmm.
And it just sends the wrong message that sleep is hard.
Yeah.
And our message is that sleep is effortless.
Right. Yes, exactly. Exactly. And, we're saying all the time, the more we pay attention to sleep, the more the brain learns sleep is something to pay attention to, right? Which there's a direct route to the hyperarousal. And again, it's sort of like, it's very normal for people to come in and you do need to hear these things several times over and over and over. And that's normal. And, we're reminding people over and over, and we come at it with the understanding that there is absolutely nothing wrong with you, and the ability to sleep and the capacity to sleep, like all of that is still fully intact. It's more of working with that hyperarousal response.
Right.
And that's the only thing that's getting in the way of that natural process happening. So that's really where we put our focus. But I think it is very common, very normal to need to hear that several times.
Absolutely. When we've had insomnia for a period of time, we just have these habits,
Yes.
these ways of thinking about things.
Yep.
And to break these habits and form healthier habits, we need to be reminded over and over, really.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's really, because the mentorship is longer, it's 3 months, and not everybody needs the full 3 months. But it's much more of an identity level transformation, right? It really is a very subtle shift in orientation, moving out of that fixing and sleep as something you do and back into that orientation of effortless, right? Effortlessness, and sleep as just something that happens that we really don't think too much about, And that's just it's little micro shifts over the span of time in the mentorship.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So I know that you've been through this whole road of insomnia, as I have, both of us, for more than 40 years.
Yep.
So I really do think that if we can recover from this, anybody can.
Absolutely. Yeah. When people say, "Oh, I've had insomnia for 2 months," will it ever end? I say, "Oh, well, try 40 years."
Yeah, exactly. So in your journey, Richard, what were the things that really did liberate you from the rabbit hole of conventional advice? What were some of the turning points for you?
Okay. Well, number one, Beth, was education.
Yeah.
And just understanding, the whole issue with fear or hyperarousal and the interplay between sleep drive and hyperarousal or fear was so enlightening for me because I had never heard this before.
Yeah.
And that made such a difference. Another thing I did was I just started dropping my sleep efforts and all the analysis I did.
Yeah.
Beth, I would get up in the morning and I would grab my phone and sometimes spend an hour analyzing my sleep from the night before.
Yep.
And, you know, I had a sleep tracker and so forth, and what I did the day before, how much exercise I did. So I started dropping the analysis and then dropping the efforts. I had these blackout curtains in my room. I ended up getting rid of those. I was taking several medications for sleep, prescription and over the counter. I weaned off those with time. My doctor helped me wean off the prescription ones. And then I discovered this concept of befriending wakefulness, and that was just so helpful. So instead of when I couldn't sleep saying, oh, no, I can't sleep, it was, oh, well, you know, that happens. Mm-hmm. And I remember when I realized that several years ago, and that was so enlightening to instead of having this adversarial relationship to wakefulness, having a friendly attitude. And it was hard to do at first because it seemed like a crazy idea, like a charging grizzly bear. You don't want to give him a hug. But at first it was more like making wakefulness less intolerable.
Yeah.
Another thing I did was I just wasn't thinking about sleep as much. And I was cultivating more equanimity. This was kind of a shrug to the whole universe. Rather than sleep being the center of my life. What else helped? Oh, self-kindness certainly helped. I was so hard on myself. I thought, oh, there's something wrong with me. I'm weak or I'm bad because I'm not able to sleep. Well, no, sleep becomes difficult just because kind of a quirk in our nervous system. We evolved thousands of years ago to have this fight or flight mechanism, which is basically the fear or hyperarousal. And it's just a quirk that it gets attached to sleep sometimes.
Yeah.
So I think those were the things that really helped me, and just focusing more on life and less on sleep really helped.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. I love that word, equanimity. I just love that word.
Me too, yeah.
You know, I kind of think of you as like the resident thought expert because you know a lot about how to guide people with their thinking. And I remember, you know, you've said many times you used to, you know, think about sleep for like 6 hours a day. And how, you know, you recognize that and you even would set a bit of a deadline for yourself, right? Like, oh, I'm only going to think about this for X amount of time and then I'm done and then I'm putting it away. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's so great. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, I think that we've covered a lot of great ground today, Richard. Is there anything else that you would like to add or share or that you think we should talk about?
Well, one last thing I just wanted to bring up, and that is the kind of parallel with eating and sleeping. Okay?
Oh, yes.
We talked about the mainstream definition of insomnia as just, you know, having trouble sleeping. Well, what about the mainstream definition of anorexia? For these people who withhold food, they don't eat because they're afraid of gaining weight. Mm-hmm. Well, in that case, they get the definition right. They put fear or anxiety in the center. They're afraid of gaining weight. Mm-hmm. Now, with insomnia, they don't use a parallel definition identifying fear as being at the root of insomnia. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of parallels between eating and sleeping, something we need in both cases. And we need to have, I guess, what we could call food drive. Mm-hmm. It's been a long time since we've eaten, so we have a good appetite. And then we have to have, you know, absence of anxiety around it. Most of us don't have a problem with anxiety around food, but this subpopulation of people with anorexia do. So It's really fortunate that mainstream approaches have identified fear with anorexia, and if only they'd identify fear as being at the root of insomnia, we'd be in much better shape.
Oh, yes. That's such a relatable example. And I think, you know, for a lot of these things, first of all, I think it's fun to be on the leading edge of this because I do think we're heading in this direction where, you know, this will be more recognized in the mainstream eventually. But that it does come back to fear. And I think fear stems from a separation of trust. You know, there's some sort of loss of trust or loss of separation of self in that experience. But that is really an excellent example. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, anything else that comes to mind after that?
I think that's it, Beth. I just really wanted this to be kind of a foundational discussion about how to approach sleep and insomnia. and how to understand where mainstream people are coming from when they try to help with insomnia, and how this often goes south.
Yeah. I think, when I was in it, I really felt like it was like more of a sleep management system. It was more like, how can I manage this problem? And we're really about getting underneath the root of the problem, so you don't have to manage it anymore and you can just live your life.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, it has been absolutely wonderful having you on the show. I hope you come back again.
I've thoroughly enjoyed this, Beth, and I look forward to coming back again for another podcast.
Sounds good to me. I will see you inside the mentorship. And this wraps up another episode of Mind, Body, Sleep. If you need some help getting free from insomnia, join us in the mentorship and we'll help you get your life back. But for now, thanks for listening and we'll see you next time. Thanks for being here today. If you love what you heard on today's episode, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the podcast. And if you need more support with your sleep, join me in the Mind, Body, Sleep Mentorship. This 3-month one-on-one program will transform your relationship with sleep so you can get back to living the life that you love, free from the fear of not sleeping. Head on over to bethkendall.com for more details. I'll see you next time.